Like it or love it, Front Facing Sonar seems to be here to stay, and I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. So we might as well have a good conversation about it with somebody that knows a lot about it, and I think has some really fresh perspectives on the topic. So I'm sure there'll be some people in the chat, they're all for it, love it as a learning tool, and some that are staunchly against it. But I think we'll have a good spirited conversation tonight with our guests. So welcome all to HellaBass Live on a Wednesday night. It's good to be back on our normal night, presented by Arsenal Fishing, boosted by Powerhouse Lithium, and let's get right into it. Let's get our guest on the show. Welcome, Drew Gill. What's going on?
What's going on, man? I really appreciate you having me on. I'm looking forward to having a conversation.
Yeah, so I should say, welcome, BPT Pro Angler and MLF Invitational winner, Drew Gill. How's that? Does that sound a little better?
Dude, I mean, it's still like that win at Rayburn this year is something that, like, anybody that fishes at any level, regardless of whether we're fishing club tournaments or fishing big tournaments, I mean, getting a win in an event is something that always makes your year. And that's something that's definitely been a hallmark for mine. So it's something that as long as I can milk it, I'm gonna try to, because it's just something that brings a smile to my face every time. So yeah, it's pretty crazy, man. But it's been a good year.
Do you think that is there something? I mean, like, a win is a win at that level, but like, is winning at a place like Rayburn, like an historic venue, make it a little cooler in
Yeah,
your
man. I
mind, or is
mean,
it just the same? What do you think?
dude, like, I guess there's probably a spectrum, and I think if you're on one side of the spectrum or the other, it's really cool, because, like, if you went on like where we're going next week, a Chewan River, or like a Dale Hollow, where there's a very famous fishery, but there's never been any major events there, or like you went on somewhere obscure, or like a weird tournament like the Smith Lake event that the elites are going to have this year in June or July, whenever they're going, like an obscure event, or like you want to win somewhere that's like a Gunnersville, a St. Lawrence River, an Okeechobee, a
Right.
Chickamauga, very famed, like, acclaimed reservoir, and Rayburn is one of those. And to get to go down there on so many people's home turf and come out and get a win was something that I will never take for granted. I mean, it definitely was, of the places I could have gotten to win an event, it's definitely one that I wanted to have the opportunity to, and so to get it done made me happiest man in the world for sure.
Right on. Well, Brian says, sounds good, looks good. So we got an audio check from the audience. We'll be answering some questions tonight for sure. So, I mean, having a great season. You're fifth in the BPT Angler of the Year points with, I think, 3 events to go or something like that. You're basically halfway through both seasons,
Yep.
And fifth in the points, fishing all the invitationals. So you're fishing 2 tour level events, fifth in both, having a great season. 1 on Rayburn in Invitational. You got a second, third, and a fourth in the BPT. Things are rolling for you this year, and I mean, not that long ago, right? If we at the end of the lacrosse tournament, right, last year, where Matt Steffen won, I think at that time you were the first angler not qualified for the BPT. Do I remember correctly?
You remember absolutely correctly. That tournament was really it was one of those things, like, man, I set myself up really poorly at the beginning of the season last year by just missing a check at Okeechobee and having a bomb at Clarks Hill. And I came out, had 2 consecutive top 10s at Eufaula and Ozarks, made another check at the Potomac River, and then I came to lacrosse knowing that if I gave myself a top 10, I'd have a chance of catching Marshall in Rookie of the Year and consequently making the BPT cut. And just came up a handful of points shy. And, after making that charge the last 2/3 of the season, and putting all in all that work and all that time to try and make up for my mistakes, and just narrowly missing, I mean, that was something that really sunk into me very quickly. And I spent a couple hours in that parking lot at lacrosse pretty introspectively thinking about what in the world just happened, and the fact that I was looking another year, the Invitational's dead in the face, with being tied for 150th in points again after that. And through obviously some rule changes and some field shaking around, they had a few spots that ended up being bestowed upon me and the couple people behind me, and so got the opportunity to come up and fish. And anytime you have that opportunity, I mean, obviously I put myself in that scenario by having a great year, even though I just missed the cut to qualify for the VPT, put myself in the position to almost make it through having a great year. So yeah, had some validity there. But anytime you get in to anything, any tour, competition, whatever sport you're in, really, if you get in through some sort of what we'll call a an opportunity or asterisk kind of opportunity, you really feel in your heart that like when you get that opportunity, that you better step in and you better slam the door in the process. You better like no doubt that you deserve that opportunity, even if you didn't qualify through the conventional means. And that's been my goal all year, and so far so good.
Yeah, and so I mean, just put it out there, I guess if you want to call it technicality, asterisk, second round, right? Guys like Ish, I don't remember who else, a few other
Russ
guys,
Lane, Jeff
Cody
Crete,
Meyer.
and Cody Meyer.
Yeah, so a
Yeah.
handful of guys decided the BBT wasn't the best fit for them anymore, and they were going to take their shot at the Bassmaster Opens. So BPT chose to go down the Invitational Angler of the Year, and you were the next one up, along with
Mhm.
4, 5, 6 other anglers. Something. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
it was a
think
handful.
Colby Schrumpf and then Jacopo got in.
Yep.
Um, who else got in?
But
Down Josh Weaver. Josh Weaver got
yep.
in
It was
for
like 4
that.
or 5, right around
Yeah,
there, something like
yeah,
that.
I think it was 4 or 5.
Yep. So, but now that you're halfway through the season, I don't think anybody questions whether you belong there, being top 5 in the points and having 3 top 5s in 4 events. Is that right?
Yeah,
How's it like you have 3 top 5s and you're only top 5 in points?
unbelievable. I mean
Yeah. Well,
the
to be
like
fair
that.
though, only one person not named Cannell or Wheeler has won an event this year on the BPT. So
Yeah, yeah. Shout out to Burge for that one at UFOL. That was an incredible tournament. But I
yeah.
mean, dude, it's my hat goes off to that field and the quality of competition that they sustain all year long. I mean, between, you know, Wheeler and Connell and Alton, Michael Neal, my travel partners, Becker and Spencer Sheffield
Yep.
and Jesse Wiggins and a host of other guys that just keep the level of competition over there so darn tough that like the fact that I've got a second, third, and a fourth, and then I just missed a check at Santee, and that has me in fifth in the points with 3 top 5s out of 4 events. Like that's absolutely dumbfounding. And the crazy thing is the separation between me and Wheeler, who's leading our AOI right now, is really not that close.
Right.
Like the separation between him and I think Alton's in second, and the separation between them and everybody else is staggering for sure. It's really daunting because like your goal when you come into any tour, that's if there's an Angler of the Year trophy, you want to win it. But going out and fishing against that field points wise, trying to compete all year long on a tour style deal is so incredibly. I guess it's just intense, and to be where I'm at in the points right now, like although I'd love to be leading and love to be near the top, I'm not content with where I am. Obviously, I want to aspire to more over the next few years, but I'm entirely content with where I am right now.
Yeah. So still pretty young. How old are you, Drew?
I'm 22. Turned 22 last
22.
week. So
So
yeah.
congratulations on being able to drink a beer for like a full year now. Um, but so like last year was your rookie year on the invitationals. Walk us back. Where does Drew Gill start getting serious about bass fishing? Was it junior clubs, high school? Did you do college fishing? Give people kind of the 10,000-foot cruise through those 5 pivotal years, I guess, that you before you became a pro.
Yeah. So the big transition for me was me and my dad, fished a ton growing up. He was always bass fishing. I just kind of fished for whatever bit. I was cool with just reeling something in. And as that's the story really for a lot of people from the Midwest is that like, we don't all our fisheries can be pretty varied. They're not always like, especially from my, Illinois, Indiana areas, like our fisheries are generally not the greatest. And if you can just go out and get bit by something, you're cool with it. But around the age of 13, 14, that's when I really started making the transition to actual bass fishing. I've got a pretty competitive streak. I played sports a lot growing up just because it was kind of my way to vent that competitive, you know, that competitive mode in me. And I started getting into bass fishing about 13, 14 years old. And that's when I knew I was going to do it for a very long time. I didn't know, it wasn't one of those things where I was like, I'm gonna make it, regardless of what happens, no plan B. This is what I'm doing. It was just I love bass fishing. I know I'm gonna do this for a long time. And I got into high school fishing, started getting into competitive fishing about my junior year of high school. I got to do that a little bit, and then COVID hit my senior year and lost my senior year of high school fishing. Fished some local tournaments when they started opening it back up again this summer. But ultimately, kind of lost that year a little bit in translation. But so me and my dad started the club at Wabash Valley College my freshman year, and raised the funds through the school and through some fundraising programs to be able to travel some to some tournaments my freshman year of college. And I was like, this is super cool opportunity. I bought a boat my junior year of high school. Sophomore or junior year, I bought my Ranger that I had at the time, and it was an '01 Ranger. I bought it and went and cut people's yards and paid it off until motor blew up, and then started back over on that. But had that boat, rigged it out the way I had a Tarova on it, and then I had a 9-inch live scope screen, and I had, I think, two 7-inch Lorances at the time. Was what was on that boat, and rigged it out to where I felt like I was at least semi in the know on the electronics, and then started fishing some college tournaments my freshman year. And I was like, this is gonna be super cool. I'm gonna get the opportunity to fish some new fisheries, see the country on the college's dollar. This is gonna be an awesome experience and an opportunity to really get to see where I stack up on a national level against a lot of other anglers that are fishing a tour style deal, traveling to places they're not at, on a routine basis. And getting the opportunity to do that, I stepped into it my freshman year going, this is going to be super cool. By the end of my freshman year, I had not a ton of success. Like, it wasn't like you look at my rap sheet and just see top 10, top 10, top 10, top 10. But I had a top 10, I had a couple top 25s. And it was one of those things where, I was like, this it's just enough success that I really wanted more of it, but it didn't come easy enough where I felt like I was just going to step out and own it. But that was the moment where I was like, I think I want to take a stab at this. Like, Toyotas, at that time, I was like, Toyotas opens, I don't care what the next level is. I at least want to give myself the chance at some point. And I got the opportunity to fish Toyotas my sophomore year. Somebody paid for one division of the Toyotas for me to fish. And I stepped in, fished those, qualified for the championship, finished third at the championship, was able to help float my entry fees for the invitationals, and stepped and kind of, it's one of those situations where people just go out and they fish tournaments and they make money where they need to make it and just work their way up. And I couldn't have been more fortunate or more blessed in the way that it worked out for me. But that's kind of from the start of my love and bass fishing and now, for me,
Yeah.
at least.
What division of the Toyotas did you fish?
So I got to fish the Plains division, plus I fished a wild card at Gunnersville.
Sure.
In the spring, just as a wild card event to make sure I made the championship. But I fished the Plains.
Get those extra points for the
Yeah.
Yep. So you said you started with an '01 Ranger. How long did you fish out of that?
So I fished out of that boat through part of my invitational season last year. I actually still have the boat. We were just messing with stuff on it the other night. But so I fished out of that boat through Lake of the Ozarks last year. So it was a big part of my season last year too. It was awesome boat, nothing but great things to say about it. And it was my start, man. Like that, those model boats were fantastically designed and built. Like, you couldn't run it wrong, you couldn't load it wrong. It was just like a super easy boat to get into and understand when I went from an aluminum boat to an actual bass boat. And so I was tickled pink to have it, and it was what got me through till halfway through last year.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So pretty fast trajectory, all said and done. Aaron wants to know, so tournament record before Front Facing Sonar, it doesn't sound like you really fished much. I mean, at a high level, right? Like maybe some junior stuff or high school stuff, but you've kind of grown up in the FFS age for the most part.
Yeah, that's the thing, man. It's like I stepped into it with the height of forward facing sonar. I think Cody Huff won that Toledo Bend College tournament the year that I was a senior in high school. So I kind of stepped into full-time tournament fishing at the same time forward facing sonar was coming to the forefront. And so I don't have any really cached records of how I fished beforehand, because most of my fishing beforehand was local tournaments or just fun fishing. But it's something that obviously I grew up fishing without it, but it's something as a competitive level I have been using it in a major way. ever since I got it. So
We got Easton Fothergill lurking on IG, looking for some front facing nuggets. Always looking to learn, I think.
Easton's awesome. He's one of my favorites for sure.
uh, cool. What was I gonna say? So here's Aaron loves to ask questions. So he says a lot of live scopers say they don't need front facing sonar. They're good without it. Just wondering if you think you need it or not to compete.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on, the perspective of how they're using it. If somebody is spending all their time fishing for purely suspending fish, then I would say that that's like you would be leaning on it extremely heavily, and to say that you don't need it to do what you do would definitely be a misleading statement. For me, I'm firmly confident in what I've learned about bass behavior just by using it and learning about what fish do in their environments on a day-to-day basis all year long. That you take it away, I'm still extremely competitive. That being said, anybody that leans on it as heavily as I do is going to have an advantage by using it because you're choosing to manipulate the information as much as possible. And so I'm just trying to essentially super saturate myself with info. And if you were able to take away that super saturation and take it from, a wide open faucet to a drip, there's still info there. And if you know what to do with it, you're still going to be better off than most. But when you super saturate someone with info, when you open that faucet of info up and somebody is really good at taking that info, handling it, and offloading it into some sort of decision, you're always going to be best when you have the most information available if you're somebody that likes to constantly make decisions. And that's what I base a lot of my tournaments off of. So yeah, like would I fish at the step out, fish the BPTs and immediately see a lot of success at a very high level without it? No, I don't believe that I would step out and have 3 top 5s, but I feel like I'd be in the top 10, top 12 in AOY right now, even without it, because yes, my process relies on it a lot to fine tune what I do, but ultimately what you've learned from using the technology teaches you so much about their behavior that you can be super competitive without it, even if you're somebody that leans on it heavily.
Right. So I mean, do you think we talked about your rapid, ascension, right? Do you think you make that jump to the BPT in 2 years without technology, without having those years of learning? Like, being a lot of it was on the water, and I'm not thinking about the tournaments, but I think a
Yeah.
lot of it was, I think you've talked about this on other streams and podcasts, is because you spend a lot of time in the water, and you describe it, I think, as a data collection device, right? So I
Mhm.
think, are you able to collect enough data to get where you are today without the technology, do you think?
No, man, there's no way. Like that technology has been, it's a gateway that allows, if you want to take that opportunity to learn rapidly, it gives you the ability to. And coming from Illinois, especially coming from a lot of the little lakes we fish on the south half of the state, and growing up, fishing on the weekends because my dad taught and worked all week, or taught and worked all week, and I had school and things like that. I wasn't able to fish all week, and I wasn't able to go travel long distances to most of my tournaments just because it wasn't efficient in terms of time and money. And so, I was able to go out and go fishing on the weekends in our aluminum boat, but it wasn't something that gained me a lot of major fishery experience at a rapid rate. And there's no substitute for time on the water. If you have no way of understanding exactly what's going on in a very fast amount of time, if you're talking about learning a new fishery, if you take away the ability to truly control the experiment, you can't learn at the rate that other people that understand the fishery can learn, because they're already understanding. They're building those building blocks over time that they can build on top of much more rapidly. And if you don't have those building blocks built, we were talking pre-practicing for events for a week at a time for a lot of these, just to catch up to the learning curve of a lot of these kids that I was fishing against in high school that had fished these places for years and years, and had the opportunity to fish with boat captains or dads that had such a wealth of knowledge on so many fisheries. Like my one way of really closing the gap for me, without having to dump $40,000, $40,000 a year into going to these places and pre-practicing, or going and spending the time necessary on these places, taking 10, 12 weeks out of the year to learn through manual labor, essentially through, what I'd call a sweat equity process, versus if I was able to take that money that I earned and I bought myself a 9-inch unit and a transducer. And I was like, if I can master this technology and understand what I'm looking at, then I can go and unlock the fisheries based on learning the fish rather than just trying to learn areas or patterns on certain fisheries. I can just learn how the fish act and how fish use their environment and be able to replicate that process through fishery to fishery to fishery because I understand the fish themselves. I'm not just understanding fisheries on a case by case basis. I'm understanding the fish. And so that technology was absolutely pivotal in learning all of those processes because I was able to actually, say, okay, I have the ability to see into this underwater world. And I took it and combined it with the time that college fishing gave me to go see all these new fisheries. And it was a dynamite combination of having the opportunity to learn and then taking the technology and the time and the effort to actually learn it. And it's been, absolutely the cornerstone of what's gotten me to this point.
Yeah. So, and kind of what I think you were saying there, right? Like some people say front facing sonar is too expensive. And I think you would say that you can't afford not to have it. And it's actually a cost savings, right? Like back to what you're saying, like,
Yeah, dude,
the time and money people spend on pre-practicing to learn these lakes, right? Versus what it would save you and getting, I don't know,
if
maybe
you
talk
want to
about your theory on that or what your
yeah,
kind of
if you
thoughts
want
are.
to, that's something that has always been one of the angles of talking about forward facing sonar. And with a lot of people that don't appreciate the technology is that it's expensive and it's a cost barrier to kids getting into the sport. What's a cost barrier to kids getting into the sport is feeling at a high school level that to compete with a lot of their competitors, they have to go out with guides, to every one of the lakes on their high school tournament schedule. They have to allocate the time and money to pre-practice for these tournaments on lakes they've never been on when they're competing against guys that have been on them for 5 or 10 years. And you just can't ask because you talk about that. I mean, for me, so let's say for me to fish on a fishery for about 5 days, any fishery, it's going to cost me without breaking anything, without losing a bunch of tackle in food, fuel, and hotels. It's going to cost me somewhere in the $1,000 to $1,200 range, and this is staying at Super 8s, eating lunch meat sandwiches and eating one meal a day out and, fueling up, the boat with what I need to get around on the water and like hopping ramps with the truck to make sure I manage boat gas. That's $1,000 to $1,200 every time I do that. Let's say you do that. Let's say you do that 10 times a year just to try and close that gap that you have between you and a lot of the locals that have spent years and years on a fishery. And we're talking you're spending before without breaking anything, which will not happen. You won't fish that many weeks without breaking something major. Without breaking something or losing a bunch of tackle, we're talking probably in the realm of $10,000 to $12,000 that you have to allocate a year, plus 8 to 10 weeks of your time, which as a high schooler meant 8 to 10 weeks of my dad's time or some other adult's time to go with me to do this process. And that's something that really most of us can't afford. I'm not saying there's none of us that can because there are, but most of us at the high school level couldn't afford to do that. And I felt as though as a high schooler, I started fishing an aluminum boat and things like that. I saw so many of my peers that went out fishing in old boats with technology that made motors that didn't always fire and trolling motors that weren't always consistent in battery life, and they were swapping batteries in the middle of the day. I know I used to have to do that a little bit, and like if there was the ability to level the playing field by taking insane amounts of time and what I'll say sweat equity and leveling the playing field by bringing the intellect of others to allow them to push themselves to that level by taking the ability for them to see the information, be presented with the info necessary to make a decision, and learn how to make those decisions. If you could level that playing field, it's such a powerful thing. And it made it where guys weren't so intimidated by the teams they were fishing against that were winning every tournament for an entire because we had that happen in Illinois where we had a couple teams that would dominate the entire high school trail because they would go out and pre-practice for every tournament for 3 to 5 days a week or two before. And so many kids were intimidated by that. And now that we have the ability to go out and learn, if we understand fish and we understand fish behavior and we understand how they use their environment, when they use it in certain scenarios, and we know how to consistently repeat that process, then it does not matter how much you pre-practice before me and how much time you spend on that body of water. If I understand how the fish think and how they act in different scenarios better than you do, I'm going to beat you, because I have the ability to perceive that information and I have the intellect to take that information and do something with it. And that's something that's absolutely, money saver, a time saver, a life saver for sure. And a 9-inch unit and the 32 transducer at the time MSRP was like $2,500. One installment of $2,500 and a little bit of elbow grease into using it in an excessive way whenever I went fishing to try and learn as fast as possible about so many of these fisheries was something that was pivotal to me, because the barriers to entry of like back in the old process of pre-practicing a lot or going out with guides for tournaments before you got there just to try and understand the fishery and catch up with everybody else. That was just something that with our cost of living now and the cost of travel now, wouldn't have been in the cards for me if it wasn't for the leveling of the playing field with the technology and the ability to, with a one-time installment of $2,500, to give me the eyes to see. Just gives me the eyes to see. It does not think for you. There's a difference between technology that is artificially intelligent and technology that is not. That technology allows us to see, gives us the information, gives us, just like if someone speaks, I've used this analogy a couple times, but it always, is an effective demonstration of this. If someone else speaks Japanese and I do not speak Japanese, you can give us the same piece of paper, has the same writing on it in Japanese. It means something to them. It doesn't mean something to me. It's the same writing, but one person takes that information, perceives what's going on, and is able to make sense of it because they speak the language. I cannot, because I don't speak the language. If I took the time to learn the language, I could take the time to learn how the language works, how the words flow, how they work in phrases and sentences, and understand how to use it. But if I haven't taken the time to do that, I don't know how to do that process just like they do. And so when you give someone that information, if they take the time to learn it, to fine tune it, to understand what they're doing with it, and take the time to speak it, then in a matter of time, over and over, repetition builds up, and you get to the point where you speak that language fluently and it translates everywhere. And with just a lot of effort combined with a one-time installment, $2,500, I mean, that barrier to entry is pretty much non-existent anymore, in terms of the idea that it's pushing kids out of fishing because of
So
cost.
how in your opinion, how long do you think, how many hours, how many days focused on it does it take to learn the language, to become competent, to become really effective?
Yeah, man. So you got, with anything in life, and especially with bass fishing, I think a lot of us have noticed this. Like when I was going out trying to learn a jerk bait, I spent days and days and days and days and days trying to learn it. And when I finally had one day where it clicked and I understood what I was doing with it, I did 90% of my learning about jerk bait fishing in one day, because that was when everything clicked. And that extra 10% on top of that is garnered over hours and hours and months of just fishing and working and dialing in the very minute details. But that learning curve is very steep and is very quick. And you get to that 80-90% mark pretty fast once it clicks, with a lot of techniques. With scope, scope isn't a technique. Scope is just the medium by which a lot of us do our fishing. The medium doesn't necessarily come to people that rapidly. But that being said, I spent probably, I'd say, 150 to 250 days on the water with it before like it started making consistent sense. But to be to the point, and this is different for everybody, because you're not all, it was 150 to 250 days on the water in 2 years of college fishing on a plethora of different fisheries. We aren't just talking about 150 to 250 days spent on Gunnersville, Smith Lake, and Lake Martin. We're talking about
Right.
fishing from
I mean,
Florida, Texas to
grass
Wisconsin, New York.
fisheries,
Yeah,
highland, lowland, river, like seeing all the different
yeah,
things. Cause I think that's one thing, like our good friend Aaron S in the chat loves to talk about how easy front facing sonar is, because a lot of he's talking about is smallie fishing up north, which is
Is
probably not the most difficult place to front facing sonar in the world. At least not maybe not every fish, but there's definitely populations of
yeah,
fish that are very
for
accessible,
sure, for
right?
sure. And I mean,
So
it's definitely its own deal up there. But I don't. This is not to diminish because your great northern smallmouth fishermen are so much better than everybody else at it, even
yeah,
with or without scope. But that being said, northern smallmouth are a little bit more forgiving at times. So I will say
right.
that.
Yeah. So I mean, but to be I think you're spot on to say that, 100 to 200 days of focused effort across dozens and dozens of types of fisheries
Hmm.
to get to that point where you, right, are, at that 80% effective or whatever you want to say, where you're very competent
Hmm.
across the board, from like being able to pick out bait fish and see differences and get the bottom separation and
Hmm.
be able to pick out things in vegetation and be able to adjust your settings if you're in a silty or a pollen environment versus a deep clear reservoir. I mean, like, right. I think anybody can probably get good at one or two lakes near their home in a much shorter time, but to be able to use it at a high level, systematically,
In
right, and be able to use it as
systematic
well as
fashion.
a jerk
Yeah.
bait, as well as a Ned, as well as a big jig or whatever, to do all the
Mhm.
things. I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, and that being said, that also has to do just as you were segueing into there. It also has to do with where you're at in your progression of understanding techniques. Because if your understanding of techniques is lacking at the beginning of this transition, it's going to be much, much longer. Because
Sure.
what's going to happen is you're going to master a technique, you're going to try and apply it, apply it, apply it, apply it, and then you're going to realize that, oh, there's something else that I should have latched onto earlier and didn't. You kind of go back to the drawing board, reestablish what situations you should be looking for that bite in. And like I came into it with, a pretty good established knowledge of like I was a tackle junkie early on. I really wanted to learn as much as possible in terms of techniques and things like that. Because like, dude, that's one of the coolest things about bass fishing is learning all of the different techniques and situations early on to where you're like, oh, I can't wait until this one time that I get on an eelgrass clump chatterbait bite. And you go into fishery and you're like, hey, there's eelgrass here. And you pull into an area of the lake that has a consistent amount of clumps and it's the right time of year and your brain gets going. You're like, I wonder if this will work. And you start trying to apply it and learn it and master it. And like, that's one of the coolest parts of the sport for sure is trying to master certain techniques. But if you're ahead of the curve on that, you're going to be ahead of the curve on mastering the technology because a lot of the mastering the technology is understanding by visual cues of what a fish is relating to, what the water temperature is that time of year, the clarity that in the fishery you're working with, and what kind of forage you're dealing with, as to what technique decision you need to make next. And the a lot of times I can, let's say we're talking about small, we talked about smallmouth. Say I'm talking about smallmouth on like Champlain, and I'm fishing the edge of a grass line, and I see a couple off the side of the grass line, and I throw a jerk bait over them, and I see them follow my jerk bait up, but they kind of follow it up hot, and then they lose interest and peel off. They follow it up hot, lose interest, peel off. Just seeing that one interaction is I saw a bass follow my jerk bait up fast and then turned away. That is the raw info. Once you've established that understanding of techniques and your understanding of how fish relate to certain things in certain situations and what those cues mean, now I take that raw info of he followed it up fast and peeled off, and I go, maybe that means I need to pick up a topwater because generally with a topwater you can keep them engaged longer and you can get them to follow at faster speeds without losing that interest and get a committal before they quit. Because generally when they follow fast, it's all about matching that energy and building it up to a crescendo. And a lot of times that means a topwater, that means a swim bait with a heavy head, which is something that I'd step into rather than you take that raw info. And if you're not mastering the techniques, you take that raw info and you go, they followed a jerk bait fast and then they peeled away. That's all I know. And after that, I'm going through throwing all of these different techniques at them, trying to figure out what adjustment I need to make next versus once you've kind of mastered the technique side of it, then I see that interaction. I know exactly what it means and I know what adjustment to make next. And it just shortens that process so much. But it's why mastering the techniques is so important to it for sure. And it's all a process, man. But that's what in my mind separates most of your A1A users of forward-facing sonar is their innate understanding of little cues that bass give by their interactions with forage in their environment or your bait, and can instantly skip 25 steps in the process of elimination and land right on the right decision.
Yeah. So in your 2 years fishing pro, uh, what percentage of fish are you seeing and casting at catching versus using it as a like a total system? Like as far as like roughly, like is it 100%? Is it 90%? Is like what
You
would you
talking about
think
like making a
like
decision as to casting at a fish,
like
catching it.
seeing the fish before you cast it and weighing that fish in?
As a total percentage of the fish I weigh in a year, seeing a fish, casting and catching it, is probably about 60% of what I weigh all year. I'd say of the additional 40%, we're talking a rough, but probably a pretty close to 20-20 split of 20% picking a target because it's appropriate for the pattern that I'm trying to chase, and the other 20% being picking a target with my eyes visibly above the water as to the pattern I'm chasing, and then using the technology to determine A, whether there's a fish following it, and B, if so, what I need to do about it, and making me more efficient as a result. But I'm picking the cast with, my visual cues above water. So those are the other two options.
But sometimes it's like so there are some fish you don't see at all, right?
Yeah.
Some of them you may raise up after you've made it right, like you cast it
Yep.
to a stump
Yeah.
and a fish comes up out of the stump or the brush pile
Yep.
or the dock or whatever. But you're using it because like when you make a cast, what percent of the time are you following your bait back to the boat with your sonar?
That one right there is 100%. Because that is my number one way of garnering information about the environment that's around me and the fish that I'm interacting with is by seeing their interactions with my presentation. Because bass are predators and they're naturally extremely curious, and their interactions with my bait is so much of how I fine tune what I do. But that the other thing in conjunction with that is so often, um, people think, and I say so often, it may not be the case for most, but it's definitely the case for some people. They see what we're doing with the technology, and due to the fact that really, I think at a high level with our live product, we as a whole as a sport need to do a better job of producing a quality live product in terms of forward facing sonar and being extremely deliberate in the way that we present it, in showing it that it's not a lot of times it can appear to the naked eye that we're just look at a dot, throw it a dot, and throw it dots until we catch the fish that we want to catch, and that's just the process that we go through is throw it dots. And really, what at least for me, and what is true for all of your extremely good users of the technology, we talk about Jacob, we talk about Becker, we talk about Alton, we talk about Koya Fujita and Patrick Walters. Like these guys are using the technology to help them make the decision they're about to make, but they're choosing what they're doing and they're choosing the areas that they're fishing based on all of the little cues in the area around them, meaning the contours that are available, the forage that's available, the part of the lake that it's in as it relates to the ability for a fish to both winter, summer, and go in and spawn in the same general vicinity, and how that affects the average population of fish. And a lot of times we're going out here and we're throwing a stump or a brush pile or rock pile, what have you, but you're choosing that area based on the characteristics that the area has as a whole. And the fish are just using those targets to relate to. It's not necessarily that guys are running. A lot of times people think you guys are just running a pattern where they're just fishing stumps. So I'm just going to mark 472 stumps and that's what I'm fishing. Rarely am I fishing just one type of target if I'm fishing a target. Generally, I'm fishing targets in a certain depth zone in a certain type of area, and I'm fishing whatever target falls in that depth zone in that certain type of area. So, like Eufaula was a great example of that. I caught them off sunken boats, brush piles, rock piles, boulders. I caught them off of a few sunken bushes, different things that set up totally differently in terms of the way that the actual piece of cover works. But they all set up in the same depth of water in the same type of areas, and bass use them just the same because it's just a visual reference point for them. And that's the thing is, I also think I'm just trying to at least express my thoughts of it. Some of the misconceptions I had, at least with it, when I first started using it, was that guys are running target patterns where they're just running one certain type of thing, and generally that's not true. It can be true very rarely, but generally when you're trying to use this technology, what you're doing is you're still picking high percentage areas based on what we understand about how bass use contours and use the areas they live in to essentially survive as best as possible and procreate as best as possible. And if you have the right factors for all of those, you're going to have a present population, and we're just using the technology to fish for that present population. It's not a I'm going dropping my trolling motor and I'm going throwing at dots. It's I'm hunting that sufficient population, and I'm using live scope to attack that available population when I get there.
So, what do you say to the people that say that uh, anglers, younger anglers like yourself and others, know nothing about seasonal patterns, bass behavior, and it's just if you didn't have the like, what do you? I mean, clearly you have a process for attacking these lakes and breaking them down. What do you say to that? That people are basically saying that you forget everything we've learned for the last 30 years, 40 years. None of
Mhm.
that matters anymore.
Yeah, I think, dude, there's such a bent in our human nature, regardless of who we are or where we're from, that we want to wholesale things. We're in or we're out. We kind of want our
Mhm.
information to be entirely believable and in 100% the truth, or like interactions with other people. I mean, when we have one bit bad interaction with someone else, or we have one untruthful interaction with someone else, that keys our brain to go, maybe everything they said after that isn't true. And as soon as we learn one thing about bass fishing isn't true, it does the same thing to our brain. We want to go, maybe everything else isn't true. And should we be scrutinous about what we choose to believe as truth and what we have kind of duped ourselves into believing? We should be scrutinous about it. But that being said, not everything that we believed was wrong. And a lot of that still holds true. And there's no reason to like wholesale just throw it out. So much of that information that we had, especially about seasonal patterns, bass migrations, how bass use contours and forage to manipulate their environment throughout the year. That's something that really that's the biggest thing we understood before forward facing sonar was how bass use their environment to their advantage, throughout different seasons, and we understood those movements really well. And I will tell you this right now, no one is succeeding at a high level consistently. And when I say consistently, I'm not meaning one off top tens. I'm talking about in season points on the invitationals, the opens, the Bassmaster Elite Series, the BPT, it does not matter, the NPFL. No one is succeeding at a tour level in terms of a points style series of events without a very deep and rich base understanding of how bass use their environments and how they use different indicators that happen with the seasons and changing times of year. No one is succeeding at that level without understanding all of those little nuances, because you can't understand it fishery to fishery to fishery if you don't understand those base processes, because it's not about understanding the case. When I say the case, it's not about understanding Pickwick Lake. It's not about understanding Lake of the Ozarks. It's not about understanding Mille Lacs. It's not about understanding Champlain. It's not about understanding Cumberland. It's about understanding how bass use their environment when there's different cues available. So let's say it's clean water. Let's say it's got, even though it's clean, it's lots of wood cover. It's not a lot of rock. Let's say instead of shad, you got alewife. And we talk about all these factors and how these individual little factors tweak their behaviors. And what you're trying to do is you're taking what you understand about all these little factors and compressing it down into one smorgasbord answer. And the more of those factors that you understand about how bass use their environments and how they use the forage that lives in those environments to survive all year long, the better you are fishery to fishery, because you can't understand any fishery on a case by case basis and all of these fisheries on a case by case basis well enough to treat them like their own individual lakes. You have to understand the process of how do bass act in lakes with herring? How do bass act in lakes with grass, with current and without current? How do bass act in lakes with rock present when you have dirty water versus clean water? How do bass act in lakes with steep water, with very steep contours, in a lake that's very dirty versus a lake that's very clean? How do you understand how bass relate to suspending cover in the spring and going into the summer. All of these little factors are what makes a fishery a fishery. And if you take the name of the fishery off of it and you just try to understand all of the little nuances of what makes that place the way that it is, those nuances are present in other fisheries. Even if it's not all the same nuances in an XYZ fashion, there's same little sample principles that play out across all of our fisheries across the country. There is no fishery that is just like another, but there is no fishery that is entirely unlike another. And there's always something that we can learn from one that applies to another. We just have to learn how to take those pieces rather than just trying to wholesale take a lake and drop it on top of another. You gotta piecemeal it. Certain puzzle pieces fit in other puzzles.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe give a little insight to like when you land on a new body of water, whether it's in pre-practice or the actual official tournament. What are the tools you're using high level? Like how are you quickly getting on fish in that 2.5 day period?
Man, really the most powerful tool we have for high percentaging our fisheries and landing on a population without having ever been to a place. Because a lot of these fisheries we've been to, some of them by now I'm kind of retreading. I'm coming to places I've been before. There's still a lot of places I've never been, and so we get presented with this quite often. When you're trying to learn a new fishery, a really strong understanding of your mapping and your ability to use your navionics, your lake master, your sea maps, whatever you're using, a really strong understanding of your contours and how bass use contours throughout the year. So in the springtime, what you need to be looking for, in the summertime, what you need to be looking for, in the fall, what you want to look for, in the winter, what you want to look for. And that is the by far number one most valuable thing that you can understand. And that's another misconception conception is if you took away one of two things. If we took away modern mapping technology or forward facing sonar, modern mapping technology being taken away from professional fishing would hurt the weights far more than taking away forward facing sonar ever would. Because that is how 95% of all fish in all of our tournaments are found is through understanding of our mapping and making decisions based on that because we cannot just go out and choose to go out to these fisheries and try and break them down from start to finish, from end to end, from dam to dam. And I'm just going to see all of it. I'm going to do a little bit of everything. We can't do that if we're trying to break it down in 2 or 3 days of practice. We got to show up. We got to decide what we're looking for in terms of what pattern we think should be right. And we're going to pick the best areas of the lake to do that. So let's say, I'm throwing a jerk bait early in the spring in February or March or whatever, and I'm fishing for, let's say I'm on a reservoir fishing for smallmouth. I'm going to look for generally the cleanest, steepest water available nearby some areas with gravel, which you can tell on your navionics on a highland reservoir where those places would be that would have gravel just by looking at your contours, looking where it gets rounder and flatter. And then looking for steep stuff adjacent to that and the cleanest water possible, which is generally going to be down lake or in some sort of side tributary, which you can tell by looking at Google Earth a lot of times. And like taking the pattern that we want to chase and only looking for it initially in the part of the lake that it should be best in. And as soon as we do that, so let's say I want to chase that jerkbait deal, I go down, fish steep stuff around gravel areas with very clean water down lake, and I don't get on that in the first day of practice. I spend a few hours doing that, and I never have any indication that they're doing it. I can throw that entire deal away in the entire lake because I took it and I went straight to what set up the very best for it. Because if they're not on what sets up the very best for it, it's probably not worth looking for. Not saying they're not on it somewhere, but we can't just chase the maybes or the hopefullys or the somewheres. We got to chase the probablys. And as soon as I establish that that's not the primary deal, I'm throwing it away. I'm going to my secondary deal that I think should be working. So let's say in that scenario, we got a little bit of rain and they're a little bit further along than I thought they were. And now I want to go throw a jig and some runouts. So I'm going to get on my maps. I'm going to look for, and this time, I'm switching from fishing for smallmouth to fish for largemouth. I'm going to look around some of the major tributaries, but generally some major tributaries that are very close to channel swings to where fish can very quickly make that transition because I feel like they're just now getting on it and finding areas, with lots of those very steep contours and steep little ditches, because those are going to be places where you can find a lot of those runouts in a very short, concise area. And I'm going to go run that for a while. And then if that works, I'm going to go find more of it. If it doesn't, I'm going to throw it away. It's just a process of establishing a deal you want to chase, picking the best part of the lake for chasing that deal in terms of population and available cover, habitat, attacking it, either ruling it in or ruling it out, moving your way down the process. And that's kind of how I go about it. I know there's plenty of different ways to do it. There's the drop the trolling motor and fish until you get a bite deal. There's the run and burn 1,000,000 gallons of gas, seeing everything possible deal. But that's how I choose to do it. It's generally extremely efficient. I can do it in a couple days pretty well, and it's a check cashing mentality. It's a way to get on a very strong deal, because you're chasing a deal. You're not just chasing bites. That when you do land on a deal, it's consistent enough that it carries you through.
Yeah. So what is the first thing? So mapping, right? You're using that to put your boat in high percentage spots. What is your second use of seeing and gathering information? Do you
Oh
put the
yeah,
trolling motor down? Side scan?
so
2D?
as soon as I establish the area of the lake or the type of thing that I want to try and attack, as soon as I determine the area of the lake that I want to fish, I am not going to try and gather any more information other than the base information, which is this area sets up right and it's got the right factors. And as soon as I know that, I don't know how deep they're going to be yet necessarily. I don't necessarily know what kind of stuff they're going to relate to yet. So like that's when side scan in my mind comes in more, when you kind of know what you're wanting to look for and you're trying to be efficient in looking for it. But when I don't know what I'm looking for yet, I just kind of know where I want to look. That's when I'm gonna kind of lead in with my forward facing sonar and picking an area that I think should be high percentage, and then using my forward facing sonar to dial in exactly how deep most of the population's living, how deep most of the forage is living, and how they want to relate to the cover that's available in the area. What are they relating to, or are they relating to anything at all? And that's when my forward facing sonar steps right in and takes the reins from my mapping and my understanding of contours. And that's when that's kind of like just like how our reels work. With it, you got the big outside tensioner, and you got the fine tensioner on the right that can you can either way loosen it off or way clamp it down in a very short amount of time. And like that, in my mind, that's kind of how it works for me, is like that initial decision making process is the very rough adjustment. My usage of forward facing sonar is my fine adjustment. That's my really dialing in all of the little details on top of the generalizations that I've made beforehand. So the forward facing sonar is the very next thing I step into. Side scan plays a pretty minimal role for me outside of a lot of flat fisheries where we don't have contours. That's when side scan steps in a little more. But honestly, I use 2D far more than anything else, other than my forward facing sonar in terms of my sonar game. 2D is so effective when you have a through hole transducer of running around and seeing all sorts of different things that you really don't know how valuable it is to know until you know it. And I use it for finding grass, finding changes in bottom composition, finding bait. When you got a thermocline, telling where the thermocline changes in different parts of the lake based on inflows of water and things like that. And I mean, you'd be surprised if you haven't had one of those in your boat, installed in your boat. If you put a through hole in and just run around with it quite a bit on pad, up to 35 miles an hour or so, 40 miles an hour, and just seeing all the things that you see on pad at such a rapid rate and how much water you can cover, it's amazing how much valuable information you can garner really fast with that. So that's also a big part of my rotation, especially when I'm up north or in Florida. Those are the two places that plays for me the most.
So wait, you don't just go to the ramp and put your trolling motor down and just start catching them?
Man, there are some very special fisheries that we get to go to on occasion where that does happen. But unfortunately, about 90% of places we go, it ain't that easy.
So Bateman asks, how important is it to not rely on spot lock when scoping?
Man, so spot lock can be valuable when using forward facing sonar if you have a turret at times. But it's very select. Now, that being said, one of the most dramatic examples of spot lock being positive when using forward facing sonar is bed fishing on scope. So a lot of us have watched the invitational from Kentucky Lake that we fished last month that Andrew Nordby won. Nordby was out there fishing with a crowd. You know, you can't necessarily tell from watching live. He was fishing with a crowd of about 50 boats in that area. And my firm belief is, you know, I know Andrew really well. He's a very good fisherman. One of the biggest reasons that Nordby came out with the win that week was his usage of that turret independent of his trolling motor. So he could
Mhm.
put spot lock on in 3 footers in the middle of Kentucky Lake and fish for spawning smallmouth that are 10 feet deep without having to fight his trolling motor the entire day. And he could focus on fishing for that bedfish and making actively, you know, positive, continuous casts and producing a positive outcome. But other than like specifically bedfish in the wind, or you know, very specific instances where you're repeating a cast for a long period of time in wind or current, you generally don't want to rely on spot lock too much. Generally, you know, spot lock is choosing, other than with a turret, you're choosing to take away your ability to quickly make decisions on your next cast, your next direction, blah 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 blah. When you use spot lock, because what you're doing is you're saying, you know, I've collected enough information in this area. I'm good on info. Now I just don't want any info. I just want to make casts. And spot lock is a convenient tool. It's a tool that I use whenever I'm retying things and re-rigging my boat and getting everything organized. It's something that I use on a daily basis. But when I'm actively fishing, it's something that I don't lean on very much. So you want to get as proficient as possible at using it without ever having to use spot lock to keep yourself in one place. That being said, there are times up north, especially, where it is really tough to fish not on spot lock because you are just up there fighting it. You're up there getting tossed around the front deck. You know, I mean, you fish a lot of stuff up there, far more than I get to. I do a little bit in the summer, but like when you get up on the big lakes and you get a howling wind and it's 4 or 5 footers, like as soon as you lose your headway on your trolling motor, you're done. You're having to regain all of that inertia that you had built up, and like if you lose that, it's over. I had a tournament in St. Lawrence last year that was that way, where like you just had to stay on it. I was actually fishing for my knees, just trying to keep my balance while fighting that trolling motor to keep myself fishing. But man, it's really important to learn how to do it effectively without having to use spot lock very often.
Yeah.
That being said, though, if you got a turret and you got the right situation, crazy things can happen. But it's not my preference.
Speaking of turret, so what is your basic setup on your boat?
So my setup currently on my 21 XP is I have 4 12s. I've got 3 EchoMap 12s and a GPS Map 12 up front. I have a transducer in forward, and then I have a second transducer now on this boat that's in perspective. I'm trying to get better with it, but I'm gonna be honest, man. The more I use it, the more I end up just staring at forward the whole time. But you know, really, my main reason for having that is legit. Just I have a second transducer installed and ready to go if I was to have any issues with the other one, any breakages, wire damage, whatever. Um, and I currently don't have any on the transom. You know, I'm not. In my opinion, that would make you hyper tuned in certain scenarios, but you know, still in the scenarios where it would really help a lot, it's probably going to be a scenario where it really doesn't matter a lot in the same token because it's a scenario where you're probably not going to have the time to effectively fish all the stuff you want to find. Because, you know, in my mind, that being said, that's my perspective on it. I've never had them on the transom, so I don't know. But my perspective on it is probably that it's going to matter the most in like a bait tournament or a suspending tournament or things like that. Generally, in those tournaments, your issue is not I didn't find enough. It's I literally found so many that I don't have time to fish for all of them. So I'm committing to fishing for the highest average size population that I have available. And generally speaking, I just don't feel like having those transom. Not saying they can't help some, but I don't feel like it's worth the additional expense in my
Mm,
perspective.
these questions are absolutely fire comments.
The burning sea, that's funny.
Uh, anyways, um, here's a so I don't stun. I think this is a good question. We
Mhm.
talked about when you started, which was just a few years ago, and kind of been your. But what was your biggest struggle to start? He thought casting accuracy was his, but what was
Yeah,
your biggest like first hurdle? I think that's a really good question.
yeah, man. My first hurdle, casting accuracy was one for sure. And for me, it was distance. It wasn't necessarily left and right. It was knowing how far anything was. because in my mind, before scope, 20 feet was a lot further than it actually is. Um, and so either that or the machine just doesn't know how far 20 feet. Regardless, it doesn't matter necessarily whether it's exactly right or not, as much as it matters just that you know how far that distance is in a
Mhm.
uniform sense. My biggest issue was fish identification. I mean, it still is an issue on our trash fisheries. You know, no one's going to be 100% on fish identification, but that was my biggest issue initially was was just fish identification. You know, telling what is a big crappie from a bass, what is a school of stripes from a school of bass, what is a single roaming catfish from a bass, and like
What is
that's
a keeper bass versus not a keeper? Like, right? Like,
yeah,
I know
yeah.
when I
What
first
is a
started,
12 incher versus a 4 pounder?
like I was like casting at 10-inch smallmouth and catching them. I'm like, well, this is a waste of time.
Yeah, because you see them and you see them interact with your bait. You're like, maybe they're bigger than I think they are, and then you start catching them. You're like, actually, never mind. But that was my biggest issue. I mean, I had a lot of issues at first. Like I looked pretty green with it at the beginning. I know a lot of us did, but I definitely had some hurdles to work through. But that was my biggest hurdle was just fish identification and size identification. One of the biggest secrets to understanding the size of the fish that you're working with is your framing. Keep your proportions the same. If you're going to send your out further because you need to cast further, what have you, bring your down as well. If you're bringing your down, you want to fish deeper. Make sure to put your out further out as well because like some people are, one of my good buddies, Jake Lawrence. Jake likes to keep his the same always, regardless. Like he keeps his like 30 something down to 100 out always to where everything
Whether he's
always
fishing
looks
in
the
six
exact.
inches of
Yep.
water or 70
To
feet,
where
it's
everything always looks exactly the same. Which is there's only two ways to do it. That is one of the ways. I do the proportion thing just because I like having the ability to maximize the screen up shallow and to maximize the screen when I'm fishing out deep. Basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take advantage of the ability to use basically to use the framing that is built into the computer of the computer trying to create the image and the computer trying to give you exactly what the fish looks like. It's trying to. You're the only thing stopping it by squishing or extending your screen. And so, if you're going to put your down, you better put your out. If you're going to put your out further, bring your down as well, because otherwise you're going to pull your image vertically, or you're gonna squish it pretty bad.
yeah. So what do you
And
like? Like, what's your ratio like that you like to run at?
so I don't run a hard ratio because I think it definitely changes more the further you go out, the less adjust. On most fisheries. I'm going to start at 18 down and 60 out, and I'll dial it further out as I need to if I need to go out, or I'll dial it down further. And like let's say I would say I have a standard three is 18 down, 60 out. I've got like 12 down, 54 out, which is like my shallow around the bank. Like that's my go-to around the bank. And then I've got like 80 23, 80 24 is the third one I go to. And that's I do plenty of adjustments in between, but like if you're gonna rock with three, that I can guarantee you three different setups of your screen that are going to give you a tremendously consistent image, those three will do it.
So you're hovering right around like a 3 to 4 to 1.
Yeah,
I mean,
probably.
roughly. That's kind of where you're trying to like keep things so that a 3 pound bass looks similar
Yeah.
and right, and
It
so that,
looks
that
the
that helps you
same.
keep consistent. And so when you see a catfish, you can pick out some of those
Mhm.
characteristics in a striper from a bass and a carp and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
It's
Because
cool.
they'll always be proportioned the same. You want to be able to see that tail movement and that body movement. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. Everyone's seen it that uses technology a lot. This technology a lot. A big one, it almost moves snake-like. It's a little bit of a slither, and you don't want to lose that slither because that's one of the biggest telltale signs of noticing above average fish from just your standard run-of-the-mill everyday bass that you're gonna throw at.
I'm a noob when it comes to front facing sonar. So, um, what do you think about big screens? It sounds like you run all 12s. Is there any advantage to going to a 16 or 18 or a 22?
I mean, dude, there's always an advantage in increasing that screen size. I'm definitely not saying there's not. But it's just about what you need out of it. Like the 12, I mean, it's what I've made every dime I've made on the technology up to this day on. It's been my go-to. But that being said, I've got a 16 coming from Garmin that's going to come on my boat. I'm just making that jump up, not really because I want to see better at depth or better at distance, but honestly, just because I want to see better up shallow. And I, find myself obviously we find ourselves leaning over and looking at it a lot. And dude, anything you can do to just make your day of fishing a little bit more convenient and a little bit less stressful on your body, especially as you get, you know, especially a lot of older people make this decision. They're smart too. Is just take the stress off your body, because if you take stress off your body, it takes stress off your mind, and you make better decisions. So whatever you can do to do that reasonably, do it. But that being said, obviously the biggest price barriers with forward facing sonar come as you get up and up in screen size. That's when we get into those just buku bucks screen adjustments. So that being said, if it's in your price range and it's something you're wanting to do, I'd say do it. It's not going to hurt. It's going to probably improve how you do what you do. But what I am saying as well is nothing trumps the understanding. Nothing trumps speaking the language. If you speak the language really well, you're always going to be fine with whatever size screen you have. You give Patrick Walters the 7-inch, screen with the touchpad on it, and if he can run live scope on it, he's going to beat 99% of America using the technology, even if you give the rest of everybody a 16-inch screen, because he speaks the language. And like nothing trumps speaking the language. If you speak the language, you're always going to be good. But if you can take some stress off your body, take some stress off your mind, for sure do it. That would be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, makes sense. So I should worry about getting better with my 10-inch before I worry about getting a 12-inch.
I mean, man, that was the thing that I had. Like, I had that 9-inch screen for a long time, and I got pretty proficient at using it. And really, the only reason I made that jump to the 12-incher was I was going to fish my Bassmaster College Championship at the St. Lawrence River, and I wanted to be able to kind of see them in the rock piles and things like that. And so, for deep fishing, I made that adjustment. And past the 12, dude, I don't think anything past that 12 is what I would call truly necessitated, but it sure is nice. I mean, I've fished in a couple boats with units bigger than that. It's convenient, but I mean, dude, if you speak the language, it does not matter what size your screen is. You're gonna beat everybody at it.
Yeah. So in your mind, is there a fishery, a season, the time of year, like where things collide, where it's the kryptonite for front facing sonar?
The kryptonite, meaning that it's absolutely
Like
non-player,
that's it's
like
non-competitive, or it's not
the
the thing to like you
the
can't
the
like if
most
you were gonna like
non-effective you can make it.
right.
The most non-effective you can make forward-facing sonar is on a shallow, not necessarily shallow, a flat grass fishery with a poor average population. So a flat grass fishery with a poor average population is always going to be the hardest to scope, because flat grass fisheries, A, lend to trash fish, and B, they're just hard to pick through all the cover, because when you have a very flat fishery that has aquatic vegetation, generally the aquatic vegetation takes over every square inch of real estate that it can, which is going to be all of the flat stuff that you have. And generally, aquatic vegetation is a very positive habitat for bass to live in and spend their time in. And that is definitely, when you got a poor population, you got a lot of trash fish, you got a lot of cover. That's the hardest time to use forward facing sonar, because then it's when, we're all playing this efficiency game all the time, where we're just playing odds. We're playing the odds all day long in a day of fishing, trying to stay as efficient as possible and seeing where efficiency and effectiveness meet. And generally speaking, I'm an effectiveness guy. I will always take effectiveness over efficiency, because that means I'm guaranteeing to catch as much of what I find as possible. But when your efficiency drops so far down that you can't even guarantee yourself that you're even going to run into a bass, that's when the forward facing sonar definitely takes a hit, because you're talking about, pure efficiency starts beating the effectiveness of picking your targets, maximizing your opportunities, because frankly, you just don't know if you're going to get an opportunity. And that is the greatest playing field for not giving you opportunities to see fish or interact with fish intentionally. And that's definitely the kryptonite for forward facing sonar, in my opinion, if there is one.
Yeah. So do you watch any heavy hitters?
Oh yeah, dude. I watched the
Yeah.
heck out of that. That
Okay.
was a fun
So
event to watch.
would you have done your thing in that tournament?
So That is a fun question.
Because
It's a
like
question
clearly
that I've asked myself
that
for
was not
sure.
the meta in that tournament. The guys at
Yeah,
the top,
yeah,
right, did not
and
leverage
I
their
don't think,
electronics.
I would have loved the opportunity to tackle that challenge and fish that tournament. I don't think you can win that event with the way that it's set up. And my understanding of that fishery, I haven't been there a couple times. I was actually there. So a little bit of backstory. I was there this year in the spring for my last college tournament. It was the MLF College National
Well, there are
Championship.
times that it
And
definitely plays on that fishery for
yeah,
sure. Like,
in the
yeah,
winter specifically.
yep.
But the grass was set up the exact same way. It had cheese on it this time, but it was, even though it's the winter time in Florida, a lot of times when you have grass growth, it's still topped out, it's still matted out even in the winter. And I had the opportunity to at least ply around this playing field that they fished in, and seeing how it sets up, seeing how that grass canopies in those clumps, and it's really clumpy. So like there's towers of grass, and then there's holes where there's absolutely not a blade, and then there's towers of grass, long strip mats, and then veins of empty water that run around it. And the thing is, when they start canopying out, and you get that pocket, that emptiness inside, it a lot of times beckons a lot of those bigger fish in. I don't think you can win that tournament. I could be wrong. I don't think you can win that tournament on forward facing sonar. That being said, I you could have absolutely, I'm a firm believer you can always make it play. You can always be competitive with it because it's an effectiveness tool. It's going to allow you to maximize every opportunity, and you're going to get opportunities outside of those mats. But you're going to have to kind of pick your opportunities in that sort of scenario. And I don't think that you have enough readily available opportunities on that fishery this time of year to win that tournament without doing the frog deal. I mean, to be
Yeah.
fair,
So I mean,
to
obviously
be
it's hard
fair,
to say armchair, but
yeah.
do you think you would have been out there doing what you do best, trying to catch a 13th place finish and get a decent check, or do you think you would have found yourself pitching and throwing a frog
If that's a regular season tournament, I'm out there nickel and diming, trying to do my
to
best to be
maximize your
consistent.
points and
If
wait
I'm
till the
in
next
that,
tournament to take your swing?
however, I have a soft spot for throwing a topwater, and I have a soft spot for throwing a frog. And if I was in that tournament, I think that frog deal probably would have been what I would have ended up landing. I say that there was a little bit of a walking bait bite for some people. I know Becker got on it a little bit, but I that's probably what I would have ended up doing. Is I'm imagining I probably would have gotten on a topwater deal. That's a deal that I love chasing when I can. But I probably would have been throwing a walking bait quite a bit. That I would have been fishing some edges and things like that. So I probably wouldn't have been competing to win because I mean when you see okay, talking about like mat fishing and things like that, over the years at Guntersville, Chickamauga, La Crosse, Jordan has proved that he is one of very few in terms of understanding how to fish a mat effectively and more efficiently than most others. And that's something that frankly I don't think, is anything that I could compete with him at in terms of trying to beat him at it. But that it would have been fun to get to be a part of if I could, but
Yeah.
I don't know realistically see, we all have our strengths, we all have our strong points. I pride myself in being a guy that makes safe bets, makes good decisions, makes the most of what I can, and lets the chips fall where they may. I'm not a swinger. I'm not a guy that tries to go out and win every tournament. Jordan's one that's what a guy that I would consider a closer. And when you put him in a scenario where he has the chance to win, a lot of times he does. And that's what happened last week. And I would have loved to have gotten the opportunity to fish that tournament. I'm sitting good in the points to try and qualify for next year's, but I don't think there's any way forward facing sonar wins that tournament, just from my perspective at least.
Yeah. So you said you were out on the Potomac today throwing a frog.
Mm-hmm.
So is that safe to say you were not watching your frog on front facing sonar today?
Not today. There's so much shallow matted milfoil on the Potomac that it's such a mess. You really couldn't see it much. But it was a fun time. Didn't catch a ton, but we got a couple big bites today, which was always a good time getting a couple. When you're getting into that swing of tidal fishing and stuff like that, like a big part of tidal fisheries, especially like northern grass fisheries, is like getting over that hump of finding out how to consistently egg out a above average bite, and we were able to get a handful of those today. So that was something that definitely excited me for sure, just because you want to get in that mindset of like chasing that above average bite, and on northern grass fisheries, fishing for largemouth, like that's such a big thing, is like breaking that glass ceiling of like that 3 and change, mid 3 mark, and we got a couple of those, high 4 or 5 bites today, and it was super cool. I enjoyed it. It's always different to come here because Potomac's like it's tidal fishery, but it's really a lot like a lake. Like it's like a tidal lake, and that's something that's really unique, and it's a challenge that I definitely invite.
Oh, Gabe, Tin Horse Monty. I think
Oh
you've
yeah,
talked to him before. He's
yeah. I've
which
talked to Gabe.
big
Gabe's
bite
awesome.
minnow baits and colors do you recommend?
So, the Big Bite Baits Sensation Slim Minnow 4 inch and the Big Bite Baits Jerk Minnow 4 inch, 5 inch, and 6 inch. 5 inch and 6 inch, especially this time of year, can be big players for me fishing brush and things like that. And I'm a big proponent of Aloe Life. They make a variation of very quality colors, but my number one would be Aloe Life. If you're going with any color in those line of baits, Aloe Life is just the absolute perfect minnow style bait color, and that's my go-to on those for sure.
Is their alewife like a straight white, or is that more like a
It's like a blueback white. Like it's not quite a white as much as like a it's almost like a it's a gray pearl ish looking, and it's got a little bit of a blueback to it. It's a light blueback, and it's my favorite color that they make. I've caught,
sensation slim
gosh,
minnow?
yeah, the Sensation Slim Meadow is the other one. That one is
Oh,
a
yeah.
fantastic. That's a flat sided bait, so that one's one that I would definitely recommend a little bit more for fishing deep, fishing around bait specifically, fishing around smallmouth and spotted bass. Versus I lean the jerk minnow a little bit more, fishing for largemouth, fishing targets, fishing for big singles. That 5 inch jerk minnow is my favorite big largemouth catching minnow. I've caught, gosh, I caught in just 2 times ago into I went in December, and then I went again for our tournament in January, and just 2 times ago into Toledo, and Rayburn, I caught 6 over 8 pounds or six over 7.5 pounds on that 5 inch jerk minnow in Owl Life. That's my number one big bass catcher for a minnow bait. It's a big meaty profile, and that's one way. That presentation, it's all about action. It's all about how that bait acts. And if you can upsize your profile or change your profile from what everybody else is throwing, a lot of times you can egg out a few of those more above average size bites. So that's something that I like to try it and do whenever it works. And this summertime's a great time to do it.
Yeah. There's the Omni only had the jerk minnow and the alewife. They didn't have it in
Yep,
the slim.
that's perfect.
MJ has a personal favor. He'd like you to tell them Big Bites to bring back the chartreuse green Smalley Smasher instead of the yellow white, since he has
Yeah,
lost his
I
favorite
will.
bed bite.
I
So
will let Brandon know and see what we can do about it. Because I mean,
just timestamp
those
this hour and 17 minutes. Brandon, yeah, MJ needs his minnows back.
MJ needs his minnows because he needs to catch some smallmouth.
Yeah. Well, I think we kind of targeted a little over an hour. Now you said you wanted to kind of had some other things to do tonight. I think I got a few more things that I definitely talked about, and maybe after you finish up the season, we could do a little wintertime and get into it a little more, because I think there's a lot more things
For
to
sure,
dig
dude.
into.
And
But I appreciate
if
your time, Drew.
I'll tell you what, I got a little bit more time. If you got one more that's like
Uh,
really pressing you, I got time for one more.
One more good question. That's a lot of pressure. Let me see here. Uh, I do want to just quick shout out Chris Oberhofer, who connected us. I know
What's up,
Drew's been
Chris?
on my a list of guests, but he accelerated it by connecting us.
For sure,
So
dude.
shout out to Chris.
Appreciate it.
Uh man. Oh man. I don't really want to give Aaron another question. That's not a good question.
Come on,
uh
Aaron.
yeah. Maybe just so Bobby, uh
Mm-hmm.
I know you touched on perspective mode a little bit. Is there a time, or you said you kind of talked about you really prefer the traditional front facing mode? Do you like perspective on grass? Is there a time you like perspective? And I guess also maybe just your thoughts on maybe some tips around using front facing around grass.
Yeah.
How's that?
So grass is for me, for most people, it's the Achilles heel forward facing sonar in terms of using it, learning how to use it in especially shallow grass. Perspective mode around grass can be absolutely killer if you have separation.
Mhm.
So what I mean by that is you have to have grass that is demarcated by whether that be sand, shell, rock, whatever that may be. You have to have some severe change in bottom composition. Otherwise, your perspective mode screen is going to look an awful lot like you just stuck your eyes straight in the top of somebody's head that's got like one of those um like you know what I'm talking about? Like they got Randy's uh flat top, but they got all the bumpy
A mullet?
lumps of hair on top. Yeah.
Uh,
The it looks like a gravel road, basically is what I'm gonna say. It looks like a fuzzy gravel road on top. And that's what your screen's gonna look like when you talk about like endless grass. There's no spaces, no empty spots. Like so perspective around grass is gonna be only effective when you have lots of separation in the types of bottom composition available, whether that be sand, shell, rock, whatever. But it can be effective for sure in picking your cast. I'm not using perspective to actively fish for fish. I am using it to pick a cast and make that cast and execute it. I'm using it in a sense to be a hyper efficient 360.
mhm.
So basically, what I'm doing is panning, pointing, and hyper efficient 360 without having to have the spin around. So it can be very effective. That being said, you're not using it in the same sense. So you're not constantly turning, panning, pointing. You're just kind of a subtle sweep, keeping an
Sure.
eye on all of the available targets around you, and you're picking the highest percentage casts that you have available. So it's super helpful for that. But one of the biggest hints I have for forward facing sonar, especially around grass, use suspending profiles whenever possible. So if you're deep, fishing deep grass, use a jerk bait when you can, use a glide bait or swim bait when you can. And if you're fishing shallow grass, one of my favorite things to do is so this is a little deal. I don't know that it's possible on Lawrence's, but it is possible on Garmin's, which is something I do when I'm fishing shallow grass. This is just it's a little bit of juice. It's made me a lot of money.
For
Really
those that have
shallow.
hung in, little nugget.
If you go into your settings, there's the AHRS setting, or I think after the new update, it's a stabilization setting. So you can shut off the auto stabilization, which allows you to manually tilt your screen up or down, which means you can take where the surface is and pull it down ever so slightly. So I guess the way it looks to everybody else is going to be
Yeah.
it's gonna pull it down ever so slightly. It's gonna make it where on your screen you can see the surface in like maximum clarity. You can see when your bait spits water, or whatever. And I like throwing a top water over shallow grass on scope and trying to call whatever's available out of it. I do that a lot on like where I was at today on the Potomac with a walking topwater or something like that, or a fluke if that's your cup of tea. Weedless swim bait, a lot of people like throwing. Um, and that's something I really like doing because it takes the fish away from their environment and makes them a little bit more targetable. And really, what I'm doing is I'm fishing an area that I think sets up right regardless. I'm not making those casts based on just I see fish, throw at fish. What I'm doing is I'm picking an area that's got the right grass, the right bottom composition, the right combination of factors, and then I'm going to make that cast. I'm going to watch what I'm doing on scope because I've pulled that tilt down to where I can see at a long distance away. I can see my bait on the surface really well and pulling them up from whatever cover is available. So that's one of the biggest hints for that. But really, the
Then
biggest,
you're getting that
yeah,
feedback so that,
yep,
hey, they're not eating my white one.
yep,
I might wanna try black.
yep,
Uh, they're
or
coming in hard turning, so that either needs to
mhm,
mean I need to go faster or I need to go slower or right, like that you're gathering that information
yep,
so that if they're not
or
committing, you can
yeah,
make adjustments.
or I'm not calling them up at all. I'm just seeing them pop up out of the grass and they're going right back to where they were. And oh, I find out that they're out here spawning, or I find out they're out here relating to bluegill beds because of that little cue that I paid attention to. It's just like
Maybe I should be punching.
spending the
Maybe I
time.
should be throwing Senkos in the
Mhm.
holes, whatever,
Yeah,
like,
yeah. Maybe I should be making long casts like lacrosse style stuff, making long casts with a wacky worm and eelgrass clumps, what have you. That's something that I've done there on scope, and like that's just something that you only learn from being able to use a search bait to just like we did with a glide bait in really clear water to draw fish from places pre-scope, using a search bait to pull fish from pieces of cover that they're relating to, understand why they were there, as to whether they want to go back or whether they want to keep following your bait, and just understanding the adjustments you need to make because you used a search bait to take the environment that you're in and exploit all of the bass that are in it out to have an interaction with them and understand exactly what that means to you in that scenario. So,
Yeah, nice. And so you hear some people will talk about manually, physically adjusting their transducer.
mhm.
You recommend actually using the electronic settings to do it
Just
versus
it's just a little
tilting.
bit more streamlined. And then as soon
Right.
as you're done with it, you can set it back to automatic stabilization and you're good to go.
Yeah, I've heard some of the guys from Bass Tag talk about that they don't want to mess around because like when you got everything else in peak performance, the last thing you want to do is be tweaking your transducer, right? So
I
using
would
the
tend to
using the
agree
electronic
on
version
that.
is more reliable and yeah.
Yeah, it's consistent.
Yeah. And so here's BX Cloud kind of saying the odds. He's got the fish
Same
obsessed
deal.
mount and he prefers to use that. So
Gotcha.
do you use
Yeah.
any like a fish obsessed 0 degree?
Dude, I just used the mount that came in the box with it.
Yep.
As far as the equipment goes, my stuff is not what I would say is the most like extremely meticulous in the way that I choose to lay it out.
Yep.
It's organized, it's systematic, it's the way that I want it. But by no means is my layout gonna be like it's not the most like extremely precise is what I'd use the word for.
You're not gonna make Chris Eldane's video with all your fancy extra transducers and screens and all that kind of stuff.
I I no, not with the way that I've got my stuff rigged now. No.
Nice. But I mean, I think you've talked about it before. Like you basically said, like one front facing unit, a 10 to 12-inch unit. That's all you need to do 95% of what you do.
Yeah, you give me a good unit for charts at the console, and you give me a scope unit, and I'll go out there and I'll catch just about all the bass I catch already.
Well, I appreciate your time, Drew.
Appreciate you, man. It was a good time. I
What
really
you
enjoy it, and
you can
I appreciate
investigate the
everybody
ghost
hanging
that
out.
people have been talking about in the chat. They see the shadow in the window, so they think there's a ghost in your window. So
Well, I'll have to make sure that there's not. But honestly, at this point, I'm getting up at like 4 a.m. to go driving. So if he gets me in that amount of time, he's definitely taking advantage of his opportunity. So it'll be what
yes.
it'll be.
Well, good luck at the Chowan and the James. We'll be watching.
Thank you, dude. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody hanging out.
All right. All right. So there's Drew Gill. I think he's got some great insights. There was a lot to cover. I had some other things in my list that I definitely wanted to talk about, but Drew is great about expanding, and he's a pretty easy interview because he definitely has lots to talk about. Um, and so we're gonna take a quick, like 60-second break here, and I'll come back, and I got a few things I want to talk about and summarize, and we can kind of recap, and you can ask any questions you guys want.
Are you ready to reel in your next home purchase or refinance? Supreme Lending's Dream Team can help guide you through the entire mortgage process, from pre-qualification to closing. We have a wide variety of home loan programs in our tackle box, including down payment assistance and first-time homebuyer options. You can ask HellaBass. He trusted us to help finance his home. Contact the Dream Team today by searching Supreme Lending Dream Team or click the link below in the description or scan the QR code on your screen.
All right, I am back. I got some things we can still talk about. Let's see here. Yeah, hit the like button if you haven't. Doesn't cost you anything. I'm glad you like that part. Thanks to the Dream Team for supporting. Bass and Malone, James River. Yeah, so the BPTs going to the Chowan River and James River, their next two stops. So that'll be interesting. Drew Gill's in fifth in points. He's going to two potential kind of tidal grass fisheries, which definitely could, may not be the most effective tool to do what he likes to do or what his sweet spot. So I'm interested to see how Drew does. Um, yeah. So here's Clay's perspective. Clay likes to keep it real, and he has a way of making his point without being a complete annoyance like Aaron S at times. Um, so I do think like it or love it, and I've always said that I do not necessarily love front facing sonar, but as somebody that fishes tournaments, I don't see a way of not using it or leveraging it, and to completely ignore it and put my head in the sand would be just not smart. And I think Drew articulates and explains it well. And if you still hate it and don't understand that the people using it that are catching them don't understand bass fishing and aren't good at fishing regardless of the tech, to me, I think Drew explains about as best as anybody. And whether you think it belongs in fishing or whether you think it belongs in tournament fishing, we can have that discussion all day, but it is here. But these guys do know how to fish, and it is more than just looking at screen and casting at dots. Um, so, but if you're a good angler and you got the time to put on the water, it accelerates your learning curve and is an information tool. Um, so that's a good question. Do I ever see a day when the bass world isn't so divided, when every comment section isn't at least 20? Yeah, probably MJ when we move on to something else that people hate more than front facing sonar. I don't know. When Boyd Duckett says something like crazy, or the BPT or the MLF has some rule changes, or Trey McKinney, like it seems like it keeps coming back to front facing sonar. But when we give something people new to divide, then that's about the only thing. Who knows? Maybe something else that people will hate more will come out in a couple years. Um, do I think I'll be able to hone it before the Natty? My goal is to get a lot more reps on it before the St. Clair Open, which is in July. Because honestly, we talked to Drew. I asked him, like, what is the kryptonite? And I do think northern grass fisheries and current grass fisheries are probably the biggest kryptonite or Achilles heel to front facing sonar. The flip side of that is Lake St. Clair is probably the place that is, what is the opposite of kryptonite? It's like the front facing sonar playground. Like if you're not good at front facing sonar there, you don't stand a chance. We'll have to not untie, but unite against the common enemy, Clay. Yeah. Um, uh, yeah, I understand. Like people will show up just to complain about it. It's a funny phenomenon for sure. Look at Clay dropping the juice. Let me yeah. It's like talking politics, honestly. It's like talking about Republicans versus Democrats. It's talking about, like religion. Like it's people are so divisive, and I don't know. It's funny. I don't think he has breaks, Brian. No, I've never heard him talk about it. Uh, yeah, I do. Like, I to me, I think there should be a technology limit more for the optics of like the sport and just keeping the price of bass boats somewhat remotely in check. Like, obviously, they're crazy expensive, but like I think we need to set a standard where the tournament rigged bass boat that is competitive is like 50 inches of screen and one or two transducers, not six transducers and seven 16-inch units. I think for me, that's the biggest thing. Um, I didn't get to ask the balsa question, Bobby. I apologize. I knew we were on a time limit. Uh, the hover rig with the max scent hitworm has saved the last few trips for Bobby Balsa. The hover rig is a sneaky little rig. I kind of I agree. Uh, Bass and Malone, this was a good question. What is something you learned negative that what needs to be better? I will say that like when you're first learning it, it's more of a distraction than is a benefit when you have that curve. I will say, Big Bass Malone. Um, Chris, next time when we were talking to the Upper Mississippi, I had some other questions on things like that. Um, we talked about his career journey a little bit early on. Caro, I think he enjoys it. Um, yeah, I don't know. The people that are super against the Aarons, the Stephanie Slaytons of the world, we're not going to change their minds. But the people that are kind of like, maybe don't love it, but they're kind of willing to listen to have an interesting conversation. I think Drew makes some really good points. So, um, Willie Nelson is a national treasure. Let's see here. We covered the ghost. Bateman, he said Jake Lawrence is a good friend. I think he thinks quite highly of Jake Lawrence. Didn't have time to ask that. He's from Illinois. I think we last question that. So like Trey McKinney and Drew Gill out of Illinois. All of a sudden, Illinois is a embarrassment of riches with young bass pros. I was thinking burning season was Aaron's burner account, but Minnesota women's team did win the Professional Women's Hockey League tournament. They beat Boston. I watched the beginning of the game. I don't know what was the end score, Brian. I heard my wife screaming. I don't know if you guys heard that when Drew was talking. You hate clowns with blue lipstick. That's interesting. Darius has had a St. Clair in a week. I don't know. I don't think we can be. I think we should bring back A-rigs. We should give people that more tools to catch bass. I just think we should limit it to like 2 or 3 hook arms to limit the number of fish that get like just raked in the side with like all 5 hooks. I have not tried the Grimace milkshake. I have no opinion on it. Frank? Yeah, I think brakes. I don't really have a strong opinion on brakes, but it sounds like those are not going to be allowed next year. There are definitely small boat tournaments, 18 foot and 150. I mean, when my dad was fishing tournaments when I grew up, when I was like 10 to 15, that was like the standard 18 to 19-foot boats with 150s on them. My dad had an 18-foot Ranger with a 140 Suzuki on it. Move the shows to 9:15 to compensate for kiddos' bedtimes. This is what worked for Drew. I think he was on the East Coast. I'll probably start trying to do a little more 8:30 shows, Clay. All right. The Minnesota team won 3 rip. That's awesome. Yeah, here's about to check out Omni. Any new sneaky baits I must divulge before I pay. I will remind you that this is the current code and it's good for like 2 more days. So if you haven't used the May code, it's down at the bottom of the screen. Let's see. Bobby, I've been pretty impressed with the Swamp Lord of late. So if you like frogs, I definitely think the Swamp Lords are worth a check. This is not the lure, but considering mag drafts, I dabbled a little bit last week with the Spro Megalojohn, and I am pretty impressed with that. I'm not gonna lie. This they're not all. I mean, I don't love this color, but they have a few colors that are kind of decent. Um, this thing runs really true. You can fish it deeper and faster than a mag draft. It's more durable than a mag draft. The screw-in magnet stays in way better. I found myself using a needle nose pliers to get it in there and started, and they were eating it. So if you like 6-inch swim baits, this is something I'm kind of got some steam on. Is this Megalojohn? I don't know if everybody else has any recommendations for Bobby Balsa, but those are a couple of the things from Omnia that I've been hot on. And then the Evo Chatterbait. I think for $10 before my code, $8.50 after my code, it's been a really good Chatterbait. So, I don't know what the anti-brake argument really is, Clay. I don't get it. I think there's something about it's too easy to manipulate your baits and do strolling or something like that, but that doesn't make sense to me. That's what I've heard. I think the Swamp Lord's pretty good, Clay. I mean, I haven't had a ton of reps on it, I've thrown it a handful of times this year. They're super soft. The walking one walks awesome. The hookups have been really good. I mean, I need more reps to give it to like the full seal approval, but I think I definitely would give one or two a shot, and they got some good colors. Yeah, I haven't heard a lot of people talking about the Megalodon, but I've been pretty impressed with it so far. Skip's really nice too. Yeah, I'd give him a shot, Clay. I wouldn't steer you wrong. I haven't thrown the Cullshad Tony 450. I had a couple of them, but I sold them on Whatnot because they were the old ones. So I haven't thrown a Cullshad. I can't speak to that, but it is much less temperamental than a Magdraft. I can tell you that much so far. How much am I fishing this week? Maybe get out one day this weekend. We'll see. Got soccer this weekend, hockey the next weekend. The hit hitter's grass looked identical to where Clay fishes. I'm pretty sure Lee was adding some little weights to his frog. I don't know. If you're fishing that heavy a mass, I mean, when I fish that thick a mat and cheese up here, I like to throw. I'll actually show you a little Clay. I should probably save this for members only. I don't know where I got this Clay, but I came across this bag, and I don't know where it came from, of these little like cotter key little pins. They're little steel things. They are perfect size for sliding in the orifice, the rear of a frog, right? Like this is a swamp donkey, but it is really easy to slide this in that like that little where the hook comes out. So I like to put when I'm fishing mats, I'll put a handful of these little. I can't really see these here. These little steel pins. They're almost like mini cotter keys, and they add a nice little weight, and they have a nice little sound to them. So when you see me in my Mississippi River frogging mats, a lot of times they're loaded up with 3 to 5 of these little pins, and that's what I use in my frogs. I threw the comeback shad a little bit. Seems to run pretty good. The one I got. It's the box. I haven't got bid on it, but it looked pretty good when I was throwing it. MJ says, he's debating hopping into a tournament this month with next to zero experience and a fairly high entry fee. You ever hop in to force yourself to learn somewhere? I guess I'm kind of doing that on Lake St. Clair in the Bassmaster Open. Never been there before. So I am doing that to some degree. It is, I mean, I wouldn't do it if it puts you in a financial bind, but if it's not something that's gonna to break the bank, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Yeah, I don't like. I've done glass, but I don't like that they break apart inside. Yeah. Daxis needs a good popper rod. My popper rod is a Fury 703 Dax. That's what I like for poppers. Spool it up with like 30 to 40 pound braid, put a super short mono or fluorocarbon leader on it. That's what I like. You just go through the parking lot to find glass. Yeah, I like to I like putting fresh, like using round rubber when I replace the. I actually got another frog leg changing hack that we're not going to talk about tonight. Maybe the viewers members only. Yeah, I mean, mine is a. I mean, I don't think you need an expensive rod. Uh, like a Colt or a Dobbins or a Fury or Maverick 703 is a great rod in my opinion. Um, And I think actually that route, I actually have the Dobbins reel on. Yeah, I mean, no foul, no harm, MJ. So I don't know if other people had questions based on our chat tonight with Drew. Why MLF versus elites? Critical gravy. Are you asking why the leagues? Why is there I guess I understand your question. Like, why is there two leagues? Why do viewers want to put them against each other? Why do you feel like the leagues are against each other? Like, I guess maybe expand on your question, Gravy. Or why would one angler choose versus the other? Maybe a little more details on what you're getting at. Yeah, BPT had no entry fees for like a minute. One season, maybe two. I think it was 2 seasons. But I'd love to answer your question, Gravy. I'm just not sure exactly what angle you're getting at. Top Toad, I get the feeling that Drew would not punch Mats and he would prefer to look for that bite somewhere else. That's why I kind of asked that question about Jay Lee. I think he would have probably ended up avoiding the winning bite and did what he was his strengths. Little Rich, who's my favorite Whatnot host? Bateman's my favorite Whatnot host besides myself. Chances of somebody qualifying for MLF versus elites. And I assume when you say MLF, you're saying BPT, Clay. I think BPT, they're taking 5 anglers out of 100 and I don't know how many are in the MLF points this year. Let's see here. I mean, there's definitely not. I don't know how many guys have fished all the events. It looks like maybe 125. So like 1 in 25 makes it. And then there's 150 guys or so, and they take 9. So the odds just on an entry fee, like an entrant or people that move on per entrance, it's a little better for opens into the elites just by a few percentage points. But the quality of the field is probably a little deeper in the opens EQs. So I think, and then if you take in the fact that if more people defect from the BPT, that will open more spots and they'll go further down the MLF. I think it would be, although it costs more money with entry fees to do the MLFs, but it's less tournaments. And so you don't have, there's 9 opens versus only what, 6 invitationals. I think it is slightly easier to make the BPT through the MLF invitationals than it is the elites through the opens. Question for Mr. Gill. Sure. So he's done. Maybe you came in and you're watching the replay here. So he started in the Toyotas, which got him into the MLF invitationals. And then he spent 1 year in the MLF invitationals and went to the BPT. So it was just a natural progression. When he first put his kind of big boy pants on to fish the bigger tournaments, he chose a division of the Toyotas. I don't know, 3 years ago when he did that, he was really focused on, do I want to fish Bassmaster or BPT? I think that just happened to be that, the Ozark division, because he's from Illinois, he fished the Plains division, probably was the best schedule for him to fish a AAA event. And a single division of the Toyotas will get you into the invitationals. And then he had a really good season on the invitationals, made the BPT. Googans were the first to add glass rattles, right? To the Ned, yes. I think the rattling Ned was a pretty unique concept. I mean, obviously, a lot of people, did it themselves. I remember me and my dad shoving glass rattles and worms and all kinds of stuff and sluggos for years back in the 90s. So that's not uh, super innovative, but somebody doing it at a production level, that was something unique. 150 versus 1 in 100. No, I mean, so there's 5 BPT spots out of 125 ish guys fishing the whole season, and you've got like 9 open spots out of 150 ish in the opens. If I had to make one next year as the lowest hanging fruit, I think based on the fact that you have to fish less events, so there's less things to trip you up. And I think they're going to end up taking, like, guys will leave BPT, so you'll get more spots. I think MLF, but I don't think it's. I wouldn't call either one of them low hanging fruit, Clay. I think just by a little bit, I think it might be easier to go through the invitationals to the BPT, but I think they're both incredibly difficult. Sorry. All right. That wasn't a serious question, Sam. Got it. I haven't seen a lot of your you had a lot of comments tonight, Sam. I haven't had enough of your interaction to get your tone, so that's fine. Bryce Hoffman, should I change out my 4-strand brand for 8-strand? Worth it? Honestly, I am not the kind of guy that dwells on 4 carrier versus 8 carrier, and I like this style braid and in in grass, and I like this style braid. Like, dude, the braid that's on my drop shot rod that, like, in my Ned rod that you saw in my, like, recent tournament videos, that stuff's 6 years old. I don't even know what it is anymore. I got braid on some of my reels that are almost as old as my kid. Like, she's, like, 13. I don't stress about it. Uh, Half of the fluorocarbon on my reels has been on for more than a year. I respool it when it gets too low. That's how often I change my fluorocarbon. I mean, I change my leaders on my spinning rods a lot, but, like, I'm only cutting off this much braid at a time. It lasts forever. Yeah. So, I mean, whatever works for you, but I don't get that hyped out about braid types. After going through my tape and a handful of weeks, what did you take away from your last tourney? I don't think it really going through the tape was about it. I found spawning fish on my second day of the tournament in pool 7, and then I kept going back to pool 8 looking for other types of fish. I should have leaned. I underestimated how many fish were going to the bank and how fast, and I should have went all in on those spawning fish, whether I could see them that or using perspective mode. And I regret I spent too much time looking for fish that I could see with my eyes, and I should have used my perspective mode more to find these fish. I could have had a better tournament had I done that. So I didn't really understand how fast. I thought the fish that I saw with my eyes were early spawners. I didn't realize there was that many fish going to the bank all over the river. So that was the biggest mistake I made. And then not having more reps in perspective mode to be able to catch fish off the beds. It also didn't help that my 360 went down, which was kind of what I was using in practice to see the beds. And then when my 360 went down, I didn't spend any time looking using my perspective mode to do that. So it was hard for me mentally to do it in the tournament without having practice, not in a tournament. I did have Cajun line at the qualifier. So I had some 17-pound Cajun in my boat that a lot of times I use for, like, Carolina rig leaders. And I had a couple spools that got low, and I was waiting on a lightning storm. So I re-spooled with that 17-pound line in practice, and then I just rocked it through the tournament. I do try to keep it like I am serious about tournaments, but also I'm out there to have a good time, and I try not to get there's a lot of guys that get super high strung, and I'm not saying I don't take it serious, and I'm not thinking about the fish, and I'm not, I'm making adjustments and trying to do all that kind of stuff, but I try to do it in a relaxed, controlled way. Like when I lose a fish, I mean, on day one when I lost that big one, I threw maybe like a 10-second mini tantrum, but then it was like, all right, we got to get back on the rails. Day two, I lost a big one, 3-pounder that would have made the day two weigh-in way less stressful if I catch that one because I make it, probably in the cut in like 15th instead of tied for 19th. Like you vent and you get back to it. You control the controllables and you move on and you do what you can. Um, am I seeing beds on perspective or fish? I use 4 to 9% of the time when I'm on perspective. I have no clue how to dial it in. So I'm pretty new to it, MJ. I could see both. When the beds were really like crater like, they were easy to see on perspective. But there was clearly some beds that I was not seeing that other people were seeing because they were a little more in tune to seeing like the minutia, the really small little like but it was easier to see the fish in perspective than it was on 360. The 360 in my mind showed the beds easier because you would just draw these nice little circles. But oftentimes in perspective, or sometimes when I started, like on the third day, which is a video I'm almost done editing, I actually finally caught some on perspective. But as I got more comfortable and spent more time looking at it, seeing the white blob move around in the circle was a dead giveaway. So definitely perspective is easier to see the beds and the fish. Where it is a little tricky is on front facing, like traditional mode, when you cast, you see your lure drop. So it's easy to get that instant feedback whether you're making the right cast. Like, am I making a 15-foot? Am I making a 30-foot? Right. Like, and knowing where your bait is to drag, right? Like when I throw to a stump or a weed clump or a brush pile or whatever it is on front facing sonar, I see my bait either land on it, land short, go past it. I can bring my bait to it and I can work it at that stump or whatever I'm fishing or the fish. On perspective mode, you can't, at least I can't see my bait, right? So it's easy to line it up and know I'm making the right cast on the what do we call those? The round thing that did the angle in school, the protractor, right? Like the protractor is pretty easy to line up and make the directional cast, but you kind of have to get those reps and that confidence to know what a 23-foot, a 25-foot, and then slow down in that right range so you feel like you're really dragging it through because you're not going to see the fish eat your bait on perspective. But it helps you make a really defined cast and know the fish and the bed is there. Um, I think that is a scenario where having a front facing and a perspective at the same time so that like I know that at this angle there's a bed 25 feet out, right? And then I pitch, and then even if it's only 3 or 4 or 5 feet deep, if I can see my lure drop at 26 feet, and I'm like, all right, if I just start dragging it now, I really slow down. I am almost positive my bait is in that bed at that point. Hope that helps, MJ. Yeah, we're all yeah. Derbies are not good financial decisions. Dave Ramsey would not approve. Have any issues with my powerhouse batteries not connected? Not really, unless I'm on the fringe. Like sometimes if I'm like in my bedroom, which is above my garage, sometimes I can see 1 or 2 of my batteries, but I can't see all of them. But if I'm like in my boat, I can usually see them all. Yeah. I think you have to like you can vent when you lose a big fish, but then I think you have to say, hey, positive cue. I just lost one or I got a good bite. That means I'm doing some of the right things, right? How accurate do you think you were before front facing? Are baits falling next to the trees like you thought they were, or is that something that surprised you? Um, yeah, as far as like submerged, right? Like offshore, whether it's a weed clump, a boulder, right? That type of stuff. I think I'm probably more accurate now. It's easier to line up and make that cast I mean, 360 helped with some of that. I do think the directional puck, whether it's the Lowrance, what is it, 1 something, point 1 or whatever it is, and the Hummingbird with the directional heading sensor in it on the front of your boat so that you can have that extra, like, the one that always points so that you can line up your waypoints. Definitely is a big thing that people don't talk about, and it's maybe a little less important now that people are using front facing sonar because you can kind of basically just do it with your trolling motor. But before that, that heading sensor puck was a big deal for me making casts to, those underwater structures. But a lot of times back then, it was more about like you were overcasting and dragging, where now it's easier to just get that feedback. And so I think directionally left to right, that I don't think changed much. I think getting my distance down and understanding what 30 foot is, what 40 foot is, what 60 foot is, front facing gives you a lot more feedback to dial that in much faster. Yeah. I think MJ, like, yeah, if especially if it's deep enough where you can see him and use perspective mode to be able to give you that confidence. I think if you could have like located them with your eyes and then followed up with perspective, that would have been a great training tool for you to dial that in because you would have the confidence to like double, right? Like double down on it. It's kind of like uh 360 and front facing sonar together can really be a powerful tool. I have not thrown the Hypnotoad, Dustin. They're still sitting on my garage door. I put them in the boat. They're in my pegs. So, walks really well in the same spot. That's good to know. I got a couple black ones from the classic. They need to go in the boat. How's the hookup, Dustin? Have you got bit on the Hypnotoad? Yeah, Clay. Yeah, that is a good one. I did one fish in practice. I did hook in the eyeball on a drop shot, a smallmouth. But every fish that I hooked in the tournament, or at least that I landed in the tournament, were caught in the mouth. I didn't have to let any go. Maybe the ones that jumped off uh, were not hooked correctly. Just dinks. All right. Just the 2 hour mark. So yeah, last couple days to get this month's Omnia code down the bottom of the screen. We did not get an inside the mouth rules, Clay. That's the Drew is a bit of a talker, so he likes to really expound upon his points, and so there are things that I want to talk about that I didn't get to, but I'd like to have him back on because I think he's a good interview, and I really enjoy talking with Drew and like listening to him, whether he's on BTL or Tin Horse Monty or anywhere else. I think he's very insightful and well spoken for a young angler at 22. Which spinnerbait was that on day 2? It was the Baitman special spinnerbait. The what is it? Is it a spot sticker in that purple and chartreuse that I was throwing? Yeah, he did kind of say that at the end of the show the other day, but it kind of sounded like we probably won't hear until he thought maybe July. So I think after this next round of 2 tournaments before we go up north is maybe when they'll announce it, but we'll see. I have no inside juice on that, MJ. If I did, I would lightly, delicately try to tell you without telling you. Let's have a lot of people watching on the old Facebook tonight. Sean on Instagram says, "How bad is the comment or the the cottonwood in Minnesota. It's been brutal. It was like piled up under my truck tires at work today. Yeah. Drew, more well put together beyond his age. Yeah, that's what we're hearing. Screen height limit for safety, total screen images, no crappie breaks, and potentially a limit of 2 front-facing sonar units. Or I started late, Dustin. Yeah, I don't like 60 inches. That's 512s. I'd like to see it at 50 inches. So it's like 412s plus a little bit. I think you would see way more interesting setup at 50. Like 60 is not restricting anything. 212, like 512s is just everybody will have 2 at the dash and 3 up front. That's not really changing anything. I think if you made it around 50 inches, you would force creativity. And you would see people like, hey, I want to do a 16 and a 12 up front, and I'll run a single 16 in the back, or like I'll do 2 10s at the back and go bigger. Like I think you would see more variety and more creativity with a lower screen limit um, than 60. So I think 60 doesn't really create much interest for me. I think everybody will be very boilerplate. I think if we get 50 or under, then you will start to see more unique setups. As far as long as they're allowed one front facing sonar unit and they're allowed 4, 3 or 4 screens, the guys that are catching them now are still going to catch them. It's just going to change the optics of what is required to fish at a high level for maybe the people getting into the sport. Um, right. I agree, Clay. If there is one 10-inch unit up front and one front-facing sonar unit, the guys that are catching them in those tournaments will still catch them. I do think it will be pretty much the end of the NBT, because the NBT is just a replicated, um, right? It's just a waterproof monitor with an HDMI port. So it adds no value on its own. So I don't know who would put. I mean, like you could have a Garmin unit at your dash that you use for another purpose, and have your front-facing sonar run into that, and then it replicate up front if you wanted. But then I think to change settings and like do adjustments, you'd have to do it on the back. So I don't think anybody would do NBT at that point. It just wouldn't make sense. But you need another unit, right? So I don't know. My understanding of how the NBT works, you still have to have a unit running it. It's just a replicator. Wouldn't you be better off just having a 16-inch Garmin? Maybe I don't quite understand how the NBT works, but it's just an output. So you somewhere else. All right, so you can change the screens on the NBT. So it's not a completely dumb unit screen. It does have some interface. But you would definitely see it. The only guys that would run NBT are the guys that run Garmin like systems, right? Like if you just run a single Garmin up front, it wouldn't make sense to have an NBT. Yeah. So if you love like the Lowrance 2D and the waypoint management, and you love the 360 or the side imaging of the hummingbirds, like so I don't know. I think you will see a serious decline in NBT if they put any kind of real inch limitations. There you go. Now you're talking, Clay. NBT, where you could split your 360 and your live, that'd be something. My understanding is that there is a Garmin unit that you can actually put you can split live and perspective on like a certain model of the Garmins. I had heard that. I don't really know. Amy, thanks for stopping in IG. Say hi to TK. I think I'm gonna shut down the IG people. Jim says he'd rather sit back, like to see if anglers could build a strategy just using it for practice. I don't think that's gonna happen, but we'll see. Yeah, MJ says he can. Which model is that? MJ, which it's a certain. I have sent 2 emails to Hummingbird. They haven't responded to either one. The 1222. I have a 1022. I've been thinking about getting the 1222. That would be quite the interesting incentive for me to upgrade to the 1222 to potentially do that. That would be interesting. I think sports are slowing down a little bit, so I'm hoping to stick to the Wednesday nights a little more going forward here. So I don't have anybody lined up for next week, but I've got some people in queue. So hopefully we'll get back to this a little bit more consistently. I do have some more plans, and I ordered some different mounts to do more on the live or on the water live. So I would like to do at least one like morning or afternoon session every weekend on the water live to do kind of what we're doing now, but kind of thinking of it like video game streamers that like talk and entertain, and the video games just in the background. I want to do a little bit more of that going forward. Have more on the water live chat sessions with you guys. You'd need an Ethernet hub to make it work if you don't have more than one Garmin graph, though, Rich. I see. So if you have more than one Garmin, MJ, so you're like one is a direct input and then the other one's coming from another Garmin, sounds like. It would be nice if the One Boat Network did a lot of things, like mirror your screens, share maps. Line 21222 has 2 ports. There you go. Nice. But so yeah, more to come. Get back more consistent. Appreciate everybody coming on tonight. It was fun. I enjoyed talking to Drew. He's been on my list for a while. If you guys got guest requests, you can leave comments below. As always, here to help you guys catch more big bass. Suck less.